This episode of Let's Dig Deeper podcast is supported by the University of Copenhagen's School of Archaeology. Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I am a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen, and in this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the delightful people working in the field. We're talking archaeologists, historians, researchers, and professionals. And hopefully, we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today, I'm joined by the wonderful Wolfgang Filser. Welcome to the studio, Wolfgang.
Hi, Zinat.
And Wolfgang, you are an associate professor here at UCPH, where you teach classical archaeology. You have a PhD in classical archaeology and Egyptology from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And you've also taught at universities in Germany. And since 2014, you've led excavations on the Cape of Sorrento in Italy, where you're investigating a Roman maritime villa. And that's also the focal point of today's episode. We're talking about the Villae Maritime, or the Roman maritime villas. Now, before we really dig deeper into today's topic, we should just quickly define it a bit more. So, can you tell us what were the Villae Maritime and what sets them apart from country villas, the Villae Rusticae?
Thank you, Zinat, for having me here, and I will try to line that out before we start. The Roman luxury villa is among the most distinct phenomena of the changing mentality of Roman elite during, let's say, the late Republican era and the early empire, so we're talking about the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. During this period, an architecture of otium, so of leisure, unfolded, which by means of the recent developments in engineering and building techniques in Roman times allowed for formerly unseen fusions of the artificial and the natural, and that are of course difficult concepts that we can talk about. And those were fused into what I like to call a kind of second nature, so a nature in a second cloak, so to say, fueled by technical means but appearing nonetheless in the dress and in the surface of natural forms. The most vibrant examples of this new architecture can be labeled Villa Maritima, even though not all of them lie in immediate neighborship to the sea. They can also lie near lakes, for example, and however the architecture is the one that we call the Villa Maritima. So the material reality of the Roman maritime villa is not new to research. What is new is the way that we approach it, and that has changed a lot during the last 1 or 2 decades, I would say. But in reality, we know about the phenomenon and we look into it since the 1750s, roughly 300 years, when those very well-known and well-furnished and well-preserved villae in the region of Mount Vesuvius came into light and were excavated. So we're talking about the Villa dei Papiri in modern Ercolano, the villas of Stabia in Castellammare, so the region of Naples and Mount Vesuvius, and other places that have become very well known since then.
All right. Thank you for clearing that up for us. Now, let's dig deeper. And Wolfgang, when we think of Roman architecture, people might picture the Colosseum or the Pantheon or these really great monumental structures. But where do the maritime villas fit into that sort of bigger story about Roman building?
Yeah, I would say that they are the testimony of a very elite lifestyle private architecture. That is very clear, and that makes it also a lot difficult because it is so much informed by written sources and so much tinged by those written sources, notably Pliny II and Cicero, and the afterlife since the Renaissance of the phenomenon, when those architectures, on the basis of texts and few architectural remains that were known then, were emulated. So if I briefly address the literary record, this is a topical and very subjective record by few very successful men who delivered those villa descriptions. For that reason, these literary descriptions have had an own dynamic and have informed archaeological research in certain instances, maybe even more than the actual architectural remains. So there's, on the one hand, there is a topical and subjective of the descriptions, and on the other hand, there is the actual archaeological record. And those can also stand for two different traditions of thought, so to say.
Yeah.
And sometimes they seem to confirm each other in certain respects, but they can also be understood as two poles within which research moves. Between the villa as an ideal and ideological space and the villa as a concrete reality with its functional and aesthetic aspects. So that is what we look into if we go into one of these places and try to understand it. How can we extract from that an information about Roman society and Roman architecture without being influenced too much beforehand by these discourses about the topic?
All right, but the villas themselves, they were these sort of very large structures,
Mm.
almost complexes. And they were, as you say, typically built along the sea. So not necessarily the ocean itself, but also lakes and so on. But what made the coastline so attractive for these wealthy Romans? I mean, they adapted the buildings to the environment and incorporated in their architecture. So there must have been like a certain pull of the ocean on the Romans.
Yeah, that is a very good question. Thank you for that. I think the sea is, for obvious reasons, but also for many, many other cultural and historical reasons, is of course the epicenter of that idea of the Villa Maritima. And it's not only the sea, it is, as you said, it is the constellation of sea and landscape. And in settings like the Gulf of Naples or the islands in the Gulf, like Capri, of course, it is that specific constellation of rock and shoreline and sea that makes the setting perfect for this kind of architecture and for what, in an imaginary sense, can be filled into such a space. So, if we're talking more concretely, it is the possibilities of shaping a landscape and turning it into a kind of ideal of a mythical or mythic placement, mythic setting. I think to some of the owners of those villas, the appeal of a specific place might have been also the similarity of these landscapes in the region of Naples to certain landscapes in the Greek East. Of course, we're talking about a Greek landscape anyway, because the Gulf of Naples is a Greek region or a region of Greek culture. But if you look, for example, at the island of Capri and the island of Rhodes, there are real similarities in how the landscape appears, how you have this very dramatic setting of, on the one hand, changing seashores, and on the other hand, the mountainous and the presence of water and water streams and so on. And we have good reason to think that Tiberius, so the Emperor Tiberius, selected Capri because he was reminded of his time on Rhodes and he could use that island in order to cover it with a system of villas that took on different meanings, referring to different, maybe actual places, but also imaginary places that have to do with Greek myth and so on.
You're talking about Tiberius's villa at Capri, and Tiberius was the successor to the Emperor Augustus, and he sort of put himself into exile on this giant villa complex that he had made on Capri. Can you tell us a bit about the villa that he had built there?
Yeah, Tiberius Villa is not one villa. It is the complete island covered with different architectures, with different villa architectures. And I would rather call it a constellation of villa architectures or a system of villascapes or one large villascape, to use the word that some scholars prefer if they're talking about the landscape of the villa. And that cannot be understood if you focus only on walls and pavements that survive in a more or less good state of preservation. You have to look at the whole landscape. You have to study it very closely. That means looking at the building ground, looking at the limestone and looking at how and where specific sites have been changed in order to adapt to the landscape that Tiberius wanted to create. And doing that with a whole island, large island like the one Capri is of course not easy, rather impossible, I would say. But we have some good knowledge, for example, of grottos that he changed into places of luxury and places, however, charged with very clear references to an ideal and mythological and imaginary landscape that tells us a lot about the person or the persons that Tiberius wanted to slip into when on Capri. But it tells also, on a more generic level, it tells us a lot about the relationship that this specific kind of architecture and art established with a nature that is never pristine.
No. But the complex itself, I mean, you're talking about the villa-scape, sort of like this whole new landscape that is sort of a fusion between the natural landscape and then the artificial man-made landscape. But what did the complex include? Like, what was actually there? I mean, you say it's walls and roofs and pavements, but what rooms were there? What functions did the villa sort of hold? I imagine there were a lot of people involved in the whole complex. So what was life like in a villa like this?
Yeah, you're perfectly right. I should go a little bit into the detail of what actually is there. So if we take, for example, the best surviving example, which is the Villa Jovis, towering on a very steep rock. It's like 300 meters high. So one of the most exposed places where we can find a Villa Maritima, looking onto the Sorrentine Peninsula and into the Gulf of Naples. It consists at the center of a multi-story structure, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 stories. So
pretty
an
tall,
ancient
actually.
skyscraper, if you wish. Again, on top of a 300-meter high cliff. It consists of a central system, simply in order to have a lot of fresh water, which is a very functional aspect. It consists of a very complex system of ways and paths and roads that permit the complex infrastructure that is connected, of course, to the imperial court. So that is not something that you would expect in the same way in a private estate. It consists of a long series of baths on the west side and dining rooms, notably one which has a hemispherical facade with panoramic windows that look onto the whole Gulf of Naples. So it is, as some would like to say, maybe a viewing machine for viewing the landscape and the sea. It consists of 2 tower-like structures that probably can be interpreted as, on the one hand, a pharos, so a lighthouse, and on the other hand, a tower that was used by Tiberius to communicate via a system of signals with the Senate in Rome.
So he could still sort of hold the contact with Rome, even though he was on Capri. Yeah.
That was the idea. We are pretty sure that we can see that in the remains of that specific palace, which probably is the most monumental palace that he had on Capri.
So the Villae Maritimi, they were these really, as I understand it, these super grandiose places and with lots of staff and lots of people and covering a lot of space as well. And they were used, as we just talked about, by emperors like Tiberius, but also Nero had maritime villas. But who else would use these villas and have access to these places? Because I imagine that it wasn't only emperors. It could have also possibly been the Roman elite, maybe like as holiday homes when they weren't in Rome during the busy season or something like that. So was there other prominent members of Roman society who also had villas like this?
Yeah, we have to be very clear about that. It is not only the emperors we're talking about, and it is also a little bit difficult to do what I just did, which is to define the emperor's palaces as Villa Maritima, because they are special buildings that have to be equipped for the needs of the court. And that makes it a little bit difficult. But then we have to keep in mind that there are also estates that belong to the imperial family since many centuries in some cases, or at least decades. So a former Villa Maritima can enter into the imperial possession. There are different constellations simply, and we have to be clear about the fact that the definition is basically a modern one. So the term Villa Maritima, there is only one written record that uses that specific term, which is an author called Cornelius Nepos, and it is about a criticism of luxury of the elite. There is one Pomponius Atticus, a friend of Cicero, and renowned for his expertise in matters of villa culture. And so Cicero is celebrated as a very modest man, despite the fact that he has great wealth. And in this context, which is a context of criticism of elite luxurious culture, conspicuous consumption, ostentation, and so on, falls this term Villa Maritima, which is, of course, not a context that can be used in order to create a specific typology of an architecture. So we have to be a little bit difficult with that. That is all that I want to say. The modern concept of the Villa Maritima denotes a private luxury architecture by the sea. And that's it. And this concept is, in some cases, extended to imperial estates. by the sea, such as the famous case of Spelongo.
It's quite interesting that it's not a term that they themselves would have talked about it as, like a maritime villa. It was just something that people understood as a sign of luxury and great wealth, that if you were extremely wealthy, you would have a villa and it would be situated somewhere you could see the ocean.
Yes, yes. If you had a lot of money, landed property, whatever kind of wealth, then let's say from the late 2nd century BC onwards, well into the 3rd or 4th centuries, you would have not only one maritime villa, you would have a long chain of maritime villas extending from, don't know, northern Juria down the Tyrrhenian coast down to the Gulf of Naples, or even in other places like today's Libya, the coast of northern Africa, where we know of a lot of maritime villas, or in the region of Istria, so modern Croatia, where there are indeed many of the most lavish maritime villas.
It's interesting how that's still sort of a thing today as well. Like if you go by any sort of pretty coastline, even today in modern society, you'll find these giant villas. I'm thinking, for example, even here in Denmark, if you go to Strandvejen, you'll see giant villas. If you're in Los Angeles, you'll see it in Malibu and stuff like that. So it's sort of this enduring connection that humans have wanted to like place themselves there on the coast. But from the outside, they would have looked like these very luxurious, relaxing seaside homes. But technologically, these villas were also incredibly sophisticated. So what engineering problems or issues did builders have to solve when building on the coastline, for example, with different materials and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. If I may comment on that peculiar continuity, let's say since the Renaissance, when the villa culture, the villeggiatura, was revived, and which is still there in many places in the Western world, at least, where you have a beautiful coastline and a nice landscape, you will find these kinds of luxury architectures. But in the case of the prototype, so to say, the Roman maritime villa, there is also the economic function of these estates. So in many cases, we know that there was a production of wine and oil, and there was a whole fish farming industry attached to these places. So the idea that this is pure wasting of resources, which is, of course, something that we could easily connect to elite culture, is certainly flawed. There is a sphere of production. So the building at the waterfront, the building techniques, the engineering and technologies behind that are, of course, as you say, incredibly sophisticated. The whole maritime architecture of Roman times cannot be understood without considering that. So we have to keep that in mind. And it is not only building at the waterfront, it is also terracing whole coastlines, terracing whole landscapes, and where needed, transforming the landscape into huge platforms that could house these enormous complexes. And it is building underwater. Because if you have a maritime villa, you don't want to travel there. Let's say you visit it once a year for a couple of weeks only, because then you have to speed on to your next estate. If you're a senator from Rome, then you want to reach it in the most comfortable way possible, which is, of course, by ship. So a maritime villa without a known private harbor is not thinkable.
No, so they each had like their own mini harbor where the personal ships could dock.
Yes. I am working on one side near Sorrento since many years, and what we did when we arrived pretty soon, I think it was the second campaign, we started surveying the coastline underwater, and what we found were traces of changing the building ground not only above but also underwater in order to install molds, and we found columns lying on the seafloor that certainly belonged to a very decorative outlook of this harbor system.
Yeah. But who would then work on building these things? Because one thing is the challenges that could have gone into building it, but who were the people that actually were behind it? I'm thinking Roman engineers, architects, who was in the process of all that. And then once it was built, who was then in charge of the maintenance of it and the day-to-day sort of caretaking of the whole place?
Yeah, that is an important question, and I cannot give a very concrete answer to each and every aspect without hinting at the written record in that. Even though we would like to find our arguments primarily from the archaeological record, of course we have to use the text. And if we had not the text, we would not know that there are very complex organizations of these villae, which have their roots in how the normal farmstead was organized, but which explode into a very, very differentiated system of people, slaves and freedmen, and maybe in certain cases family members who live in these estates throughout the year. And you have to keep in mind that the ideal behind these places, and that really comes from a Republican tradition, I guess, is that they are self-substantial. So they produce what they need. At least that is the idea that sometimes is not an idea, but also an ideology that we can assess by looking into the written record. So there is a villicus foreman, a manager of these estates, and there are people who produce clay in order to have building materials for repairing what will be damaged throughout the year. And in the case of the Maritime villa, it is the floods and the winter storms that constantly create the need of repairing entire architecture.
And erosion.
And erosions. The walls are covered with very thick stuccos that protect against the salty sea. So all this comes together, and all this, you don't want to rely on outsourced work. Yeah? So in many cases, we know that the owners of the villas also had very specific interests in the building industry. Maybe they were owners of workshops and had the capacities to bring, let's say, the very important building materials from the other side, from Naples, in short time where it was needed. So there's a whole system behind that, and
the whole enterprise.
An whole enterprise that produced wine, oil, building materials, amphora.
It's pretty cool to think about, actually, that it was like a mini village in a way. I mean, so many people must have been involved, and so much time had to go into making this whole system work.
Absolutely, that is a very interesting point, and it is reflected also in the architecture that is in those kinds of architectures that are non-productive. For example, you will sometimes find towers and walls surrounding these villae also after Augustus, when there is really no need to protect these places, which maybe can be understood on the semantical level as simulations of cities. So they appear like cities, and behind that is this complexity that resembles settlements and cities, like you say.
Yeah, and interesting that if you say that they were these, or at least meant to be, these sort of self-sustained complexes, maybe there wasn't as much like contact with the actual surrounding cities or settlements that must have been, if the whole thing was sort of self-contained, or did they have relations? They must have had some relation with the other people in the area.
Yeah, of course. The self-containing Villa Maritima is always to a certain degree an ideal. That is never completely reached. That is pretty clear, even in cases like, for example, the huge system of Ville Maritime that a family owned on the islands of Brioni in modern Croatia, the family of the Lecani, who produced basically everything. However, of course, their network went beyond that, and they still needed to import things. And that is true as well in more or less the same way for most of the biggest ville. And then there are, if we believe what we find in certain written sources, then there are also villae that maybe need a lot more that has to be imported in order to make...
They could produce themselves.
Exactly. In order to make the luxury machine running, they needed basically everything. And that, again, led to a specific kind of critique, of course. So we always have to be careful, but there is not one way how Villa Maritima works. And I remind again that this is a problem of definition. As far as we can tell, the Romans did not think of the building type Villa Maritima as they thought of the building time of the Forum.
No, okay.
So that is a problem.
Yeah, it's sort of like a later modern concept in a way, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
But we've touched a bit briefly on sort of the maintenance of these villas, but there is also the whole afterlife of them, because many of these villas eventually collapsed, eroded, or slipped into the sea, or were neglected. So what happened to them after antiquity?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Without doubt, it is a little bit hard to answer. We have very different situations when it comes to what happened to them. I mean, most of them, of course, eroded and sooner or later collapsed into the sea. in some cases, and that is an interesting thing, already in late antiquity and then in early medieval times, they were changed into Christian shrines or small sanctuaries with chapels and graveyards.
Okay.
So that we find there are a couple of places where that happened, and I cannot tell you why.
No.
But there seems to be a kind of memory, and people wanted to be buried at least close to these places, and sometimes even within the once pavements of dining halls.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was very interesting. There are a couple of instances, and even though I never researched into that specific question, I feel that there is a kind of system behind it, that it's not completely arbitrary phenomenon. And then in some cases, I mean, you are close to the sea, and in one way or the other, the moles or harbor systems survived in a usable way. So you will find production places there
That kept going.
that kept going on the economic level and used the rest of the infrastructure that was there. That you will find. And of course, then from the Renaissance onwards, these places were searched for precious marbles in form of pavements, columns, and of course sculpture. If you look into most of the big collections of sculpture in the Western world, you will find a very large number of sculptures that once stood in Roman villa.
So there's a big research tradition surrounding these Villae Maritimae that continues even today, as you've said, and you yourself are also part of it. So what do you think it is that keeps fascinating scholars about these giant structures?
Yeah, I cannot answer that for all my colleagues. When it comes to myself, even though I don't have a maritime villa of my own yet,
Yet.
I spend a lot of time in these places during the last 10 years, and that makes you cannot shield yourselves completely from the impressions that you have in these places and the impact of nature, the immediacy of the sea, and it can be also a very rough sea in these places. It is always there. So this makes something with you, right? What comes out of that, I think, is that the maritime villa and its specific natural environment have an agency, understanding that agency that was consciously given also to those natural elements, the sea and the limestone rock, makes this phenomenon certainly very important for any period, I think. So we can work with that. Yeah, in that sense, the Villa Maritima is very different from landscape arts of the modern period, for example. And in that sense, it's maybe a quite unique phenomenon in the history of architecture, at least.
Yeah. I was wondering if you'd like to tell us a bit about your own excavation at the Cape of Sorrento and the whole villa that you've been excavating there. I know that it's been like over 10 years of work, so it'll be hard to summarize. But if you just like briefly give us an insight into what work you were doing there and what the villa there was like.
Yes, that is, of course, I like to do that. And I have to think a little bit on how to summarize that in a few words.
What was the villa called?
It is a villa that is called with different names. One name was the villa of Pollius Felix, which is a Roman villa owner that unfortunately never owned this specific site. That is pretty clear, but who certainly owned some villa in the region. And then it's called the Villa of Cape of Sorrento, which is a more neutral name, simply meaning the Cape of Sorrento.
The location,
and we stick to that name, which is, I think, the best one. So when we arrived in 2014, we were still a lot thinking in the lines of how we prepared for that. So we read a lot of literature on the phenomenon and on the specific site. That was the few amount of literature which was out there about that specific site. And then we pretty soon understood that we have to let the site work on us in order to get beyond that. We began to very closely look not only at what a scholar of Roman architecture might look at in the first place, which is the rests of walls and substructures and pavements, but we began to look very closely also at the building grounds, so the limestone onto which all this monumental architecture is set. And we found traces of many different kinds in the limestone, which gave us a tool at hand to reconstruct a lot more than that which is actually preserved. And we extended that to the seabed And then it went on, and then we started excavating on the uphill areas, so not only on the immediate shore. And the villa grew and grew, and it became ever more complex. And then at a certain point, when we had arrived at a good knowledge of chronology and of how we can hypothetically reconstruct the different quarters, the maritime quarter, the uphill quarters, the harbor system, and so on, we said, okay, now it's enough. Now we have so much knowledge from this fragment, and it will always be a fragment. It's so utterly destroyed by later use and in the first place by the sea and earthquakes. We have to stop here. Unless we spend the rest of our lives in this fantastic and very interesting place. Yeah, we could keep going forever, but that is enough. Now we have answered so many questions that give us the whole cosmos of one single Villa Maritima. And it's going to be I think it's going to be a good book on the phenomenon, which will have certainly some impact on the research. And now we are moving to the next cape. Very close, only a couple of 100 meters.
New location.
New location, new villa, and a very different location. That's what makes it so interesting. That is what is at the core of this building type, which is not a building type. You move 200 meters, or in this case, let's say 500 meters down the coast, and you will find the next Villa Maritima, in quotes, which is completely different.
Yeah.
A completely different architecture. And why is it completely different? Because it's such close distance, and however, it's a completely different landscape.
As you said, there can't really be made a typology of them because they're so unique in their own way.
Yeah, because it's this specific fusion of the natural and the artificial that you cannot even recognize what is what at the end. And on the other hand, of course, if I were an owner of a Villa Maritima, I would not like my Villa Maritima to look like
the neighbors.
Yeah. I would like to have a very different kind of estate.
And Wolfgang, we're reaching the end of this interview, but my final question is, if you had to pick one idea that listeners should leave with after hearing us talk about Roman building practices and Villa Maritima, what would that be?
Yeah, I think exactly what we've been talking about. It's the different modalities of fusing landscapes and artificial forms, sometimes very clearly denoting the seams of this welding, sometimes faking them, and sometimes hiding them under a cloak of seemingly natural. But the joke is, in this kind of Roman architecture and art, there is no purely natural. There is no untouched. Everything is manipulated. There is only the imagery of it, of the untouched nature.
Thank you so much. Thank you for enlightening us today. Wolfgang, it's been an absolute blast having you here today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Sinet.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that you're already planning a trip to the Italian coast, or if that's not possible, then just to your nearest beach. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode, and find us on social media under the name Let's Dig Deeper. I'm Zinat Haroun, and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time, where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!